Welcome to Frontline Conversations and to our interview series for Dalit History Month. Our guest is Professor Shailaja Paik, a historian of modern India. She is the first Dalit scholar to receive the MacArthur Fellowship, often called the Genius Grant. She received it in 2024. She teaches history at the University of Cincinnati and has written 2 books that have influenced how scholars think about caste, gender, and sexuality in India. The first, Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, looked at what education promised Dalit women and what it actually delivered. The second book, The Vulgarity of Caste, told the story of Dalit women who performed Tamasha, a traveling folk theatre in Maharashtra, and how their bodies and labor became a site where caste, desire, and shame played out. That book won 2 of the most important prizes in South Asian history. She joins us today from Cincinnati. Welcome to Frontline Conversations. We'll begin. Maharashtra has a long history of anti-caste thinking and organizing, from Jyotirao Phule in 19th century through Ambedkar, the Dalit Panthers, and the culture of jalsa and public performances that carried these ideas of anti-caste, into people's lives. What do you think made Maharashtra the place where so much of anti-caste thinking took root? What's distinctive about the region and the tradition?
First, thank you very much, Aisha, and to Frontline for celebrating the Dalit History Month and acknowledging the contributions of Dalits, Indians, to the making of modern India. And I'm very, very pleased to talk with you and share my thoughts. So about the particular history of Maharashtra, I mean, again, it's very deep, and there has been a lot of social, cultural, political, ideological churning that has gone on for a very long time, that then led to a lot of protest against caste, right from, mostly from the 19th and then into the 20th century. So people who were facing challenges in terms of discrimination on the lines of caste uh, raised their voices, and when they found some opportunities in terms of seeking education, in terms of employment, in terms of starting, for example, libraries or hostels for children, they then wrote, they taught, and they engaged in creating a public consciousness that went on to strengthen some anti-caste movements. And all of this happened in different rural and even the cities in Maharashtra. So it is a long history of this radical movement, and that is why we see the emergence of anti-caste work and that radicalism in Maharashtra. And you'll find, of course, similar examples in different parts of India. And sometimes, of course, there are ups and downs, but at the same time, we need to look at the larger context that gave rise to, for example, Maharashtra becoming an important site for anti-caste movements during certain political periods.
You studied in Pune and then went to Warwick for your PhD and then have been settled in the United States since then. How did you get into the academic world, and what was your journey, and what took you abroad instead of pursuing this in India?
I think to answer that question, I need to also tell you about the importance of history. And I want to do this because, unfortunately, in our academic setup and globally, the arts and the humanities are always put on a lower ladder. They're always looked upon as not having any importance, and then people just tend to value medicine or engineering and different these kinds of professional disciplines. So in order to as a historian, in order to know our past, we need to also we need to know our past in order to build robust present, our robust present, and also shape our future. So during my undergraduate years in Pune, I was very influenced by my teacher, my history teacher, and I was very interested in knowing about the past historical actors and how they lived and what they thought and what they did. And I was also v- very much influenced by the way she taught. So it was, she did not just ta- introduce me or the students just to the so-called standard textbooks, but she went beyond that in order to just really provide us primary sources, as we historians call them. This is evidences from the past. So for example, if we're talking about the Peshwa rulers in Pune in the 17th 18th century, so she wanted us to also look at the documents, for example, that came from that period, or an essay that was written in that period, something on those lines, and that was very rare. So this is how I became more interested in studying history. And as I was doing this, I completed my master's at the University of Pune, Savitribai Phule Pune University. And then I was teaching in Kirti College, at Kirti College in Dadar, Mumbai. While I was doing that, I got the ICSSR fellowship to start working on my PhD. And that is where I was interested in finding out how education has, education that we really, the larger society places, a great significance on formal education. So I wanted to find out as to how education has impacted Dalit women and what was the process of education for Dalit women, because there are a lot of numbers that are thrown around with higher literacy rates and how children are entering schools and so on, and also dropout rates, but we don't really know as to why children are dropping out. There are studies now, but I'm talking about 1999 when I started thinking about this project. So I've spent almost 30 years of my life studying this, and to really understand what is the process of education for women from Dalit communities who were not allowed access to knowledge and learning. And this was, historically. So we have evidence from the scriptures as well as, what people did as to how they did not allow certain communities, including, yes, women of all castes and classes, and then Dalits, to not enter educational premises and these institutions. So that is how I started. And as I was my first year into the ICSR fellowship, I got another fellowship, and this was the Ford Foundation International Fellowship Program. And I was selected to study and to work on my MPhil. And this is what actually took me abroad. So that was, I still remember my interview with the Ford Foundation when they asked me if I would like to pursue my higher education, and if I was ready to go abroad, because this was mainly for students in the third developing world to pursue their higher education. So this was a 15-year project of the Ford Foundation to support students from the third world for their higher education in different countries. And that is how I was selected. It was a highly rigorous process, and but I was very happy because I did not have the financial resources and the means to pursue higher education outside of India. So I had never thought about it, but I was continuing my research, and then this Of course, I worked very hard on my research and my application, and the Ford Foundation took me outside of India. It took me to the UK and provided me with a very different training. And also interact, I could interact with, different scholars who worked on India as well as, in different parts of the world. And that is how I continued to shape myself and the subject of the history of India. And then after that, I got another fellowship. It was a writing fellowship uh, that I got with Emory University to pursue, to finish up my PhD. And that's how from India, I went to the UK and then I came to the US. So that has been the journey. And most importantly, it is the Ford International Fellowship Program that really provided me this opportunity to pursue research in very different ways. And most importantly, it just changed my life. So, I would have done many things, even if, I was in India and I would have pursued my research. But the Ford program provided me an international exposure and, where I could, really interact with people from different countries, also interact with scholars working on different topics, and just provided me that international platform and changed my life forever.
Before we dive into all the work that you have done, I wanted to first begin from the recent, award, the MacArthur Award. So you are the first Dalit person to receive the MacArthur Award, which is a powerful marker, but it also kind of puts you in a box because you're also the first Indian woman scholar to win the award. How do you deal with this, or do you deal with this kind of boxing?
So I have, yes, some important thoughts to share here. I am Indian and I am the first Indian MacArthur Fellow to have spent, to have been born and lived in India and then moved to the UK and the US. So I have spent half of my life in India and the other half in the US. So it is very important to note that. And the second is, yes, I am the first Dalit and the first Dalit woman to have been recognized with such a prestigious award. And this is a very significant validation and recognition and felicitation of my work. So it is both I am an Indian and I'm also a Dalit woman. And I am happy because, yes, I have these different identities, and it is important as to know which identity is more significant at certain times.
Thank you. You spoke at length about the Ford Foundation scholarship, and you've spoken about other awards and fundings that you've received. Wanted to know how it is to work with these international grants. Do they really give you full freedom? Of course, which is, I'm sure they come with their own conditionalities and limitations. So, how do these international grants shape the discourse or the kind of questions you are allowed to ask?
So I have to say, I mean, and this is also as a professor who is working in the United States, and so I support students to write these grants and write fellowship applications and so on. So on the one hand, I mean, certainly, for example, the Ford has its own history, but at the same time, this is a philanthropic arm of the Ford Foundation that has enabled and, and opened opportunities for many people, for example, me, for that matter. So, yes, on the one hand, they they have been very supportive and very open about my scholarship. Let me just talk about myself here. So nobody really intervened or bothered me with the kind of work that I was doing. There was absolute freedom in order to pursue my line of inquiry and whatever I wanted to research. There were no restrictions, there were no limitations as to what I wanted to study, how I wanted to study it, where I wanted to study, and so on. And that is why it has been so significant as to how the foundation has played an important role in shaping the lives of the marginalized, for me here, for that matter. And I don't know about other grants and how people have, really experienced the processing, but I can speak for myself. And at least, for example, some students who I have supported in to write these grants, and I have found that they have also had positive experiences. But I'm very sure uh, some foundations may have their own criteria when they put in money and want to do certain things.
So, does there's a change in the global, political, how do I say, ecosystems, and there's a slide to the right wing, right? So, how does you work extensively on gender, sexuality, and of course caste? So, how does that influence uh, since you're placed in United States right now?
So as we know, there's a lot of turmoil in the world we are living in. So maybe, doesn't matter which country you are in right now, it's the world is on fire, and we already understand that very well. So this is how I do it. So one is, I am a scholar and I am a researcher, and I read and write and teach. And so this is my first intervention in the current political, academic climate and the threat that we are facing. And this is especially very, very important uh, to me as a professor, as a teacher, because this is where I teach students to read things that they are not familiar with. So I welcome them to my class to learn, and most importantly, to also unlearn certain things, right? They may have come, with some ideas they may have read in their elementary or high schools and so on. So my first step is to bring them to my classroom, and into that, for example, they may have never taken a course on India, or I teach the history of Indian women, so they've never done that. So so I introduce them to modern India, or to the history of India, the culture, the religions, the social and the political aspects, and really work with them to open them up to these to different perspectives and different methods of learning, different ways of thinking about history. This is where I want to really underline that history is not a subject of the dead people and past events. It is very much happening around us at all times. And to do this, you have to look at social, the political, the cultural, and the intellectual climate in which certain people got to make history. Certain people were, powerful and privileged enough to write their own histories, but others were marginalized. The people who were vulnerable and depressed and oppressed, they were the ones who were marginalized, but they also contributed to this making of history. So, how can we then know their histories? How do we know about their contributions? So, that is a line of thinking. That is how I do it. And I introduce students, and whenever I'm very conscious when I'm of these efforts in my classroom. So this is how I do it. Second is my writing. I write not to please some people. I write, this is my social responsibility, and this is my intellectual responsibility and moral responsibility, and this is my intervention. So I am not just sitting in an ivory tower, air conditioned libraries, writing books, but I travel to India every year and I visit the local libraries and the archives to actually dig into what people who were working on the ground have said, have written, have produced documents, have published newspapers. These are people who did not speak in the English language because they were not privileged to really enter into those realms, so they wrote in Marathi. So I read and I work through these Marathi language sources. I spend a long time translating them, and that is the history that I write after looking all of that. And so this, and I pay close attention to contests over, for example, how women experienced processes of domination and exploitation, and how Dalits were makers of history, and how they contributed to the making of modern India. And so I bring together multiple resources, multiple historical records, reading through these different languages, and to write the history of women in India and the history of the Dalits in India, for that matter. And I have done this with what I felt was important as my intellectual contribution. And I have been very grateful to the different resources that I have had in order to speak my mind and in order to make my, really stand by my thoughts and my opinions. So
Thank
this
you.
is how I have done it.
Uh, I was also just looking at how is there kind of any censorship, but we'll probably get into it later. Let's get into your first book about education, right? Education of Dalit women, to be more specific. It's something that Ambedkar and other anti-caste reformers and many scholars have pushed as the way out for Dalits. And your work showed that it's not so straightforward and simple. You spoke to generations of Dalit women in Maharashtra and found out that the same state that opened the school doors also imposed restrictions on Dalit women, Dalit girls. Education freed and disciplined at the same time was one of the theories of your book, right? So, how did you arrive at that, and how was the response to your first book?
So my first book, Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, Double Discrimination, documents the double discrimination that it's actually right in the title, as to how women have been exploited and oppressed by discrimination in terms of caste, gender, as well as class, in and sexuality, and because of which they really were, there were so many difficulties and hurdles in their path to education. So the book is a foundational uh, history of women's access to education and their process of education, and also Dalits' access, and how Dalits have experienced education and what have been their ideas when they, for example, set up schools and hostels and libraries in order to educate the larger community. So the book really tracked this through three generations of women And I still remember the oldest woman I interviewed who lived, in the 1920s and the 30s, and she was about 85 years old when I interviewed her. So she also talked about her process of education and how she faced discrimination in a hostel. So this was a girls' hostel, and she was talking about the pangat, which would be like when students were made to sit in a line to have their afternoon meal, for that matter. So as everybody was sitting, she was told as to that she had to sit separately. She was not allowed to sit in the same line as non-Dalits, as high caste people, high caste young girls were sitting. And that is how she was discriminated against, by not allowing, to join. She was not allowed to join, the other girls in her classroom. So it was very important to really, dig out and, really, one is find out, the sources, the historical documents which really talked about Dalits' access to education. And yes, you see the numbers, but at the same time, what is important is, for example, how did the British and how Dalits and how did high caste reformers act in that realm of education? What did they actually do? Did they really open doors fully to Dalits, or what were the difficulties that Dalits faced? So just finding this out from the historical records, which we do not necessarily have, access to. Second is, this is where my method is very, very important. I'm not just focusing on what is documented in the archives, but I believe, because Dalit women and even women's voices are not recorded in the historical archive, we need a different method. So how do we understand women's ideas and women's actions? It doesn't belong, they may belong to different communities, but the archives are biased against women and against certain communities. So you clearly, as a scholar and a researcher, a historian who has worked with these archives, clearly, there is a focus on certain communities. Their histories are preserved very well. And then there are others where you see that there is a lack of documentation and, their erasure. So how do you then work through this? So clearly, one is, yes, these histories are documented in the vernacular language. So you need to know Hindi and Marathi, Bangla, Tamil, and so on to really write the histories of these people. Uh, Second is, I do a lot of fieldwork. So I juxtapose these archival records with women and, their actual voices and their experiences, and what do they have to tell us about how they have experienced education, for example. And that is where I interviewed about 180 women from different Dalit castes. And so just to very quickly, share some of the experiences. So for example, a 60-year-old woman who was a retired headmistress, remembered her life in the 1920s as to, for example, how she was made to sit outside the classroom, or as I told you about the other person who was not made to mingle with other girls. And another woman talked about how she was, for example, when the girls were playing, and then they happened to sit on a parapet, and this girl's skirt touched the high caste girl, and the high caste girl immediately shook it, and she just twisted her nose and with disgust, and said that, oh, this is something that is not allowed, and she should just take care of her skirt. So the Dalit girl, her touch is looked upon as polluted. She is an untouchable, and that is why the skirt is also polluting. So people and the readers have really admired the ways in which I have brought out these voices of women, and also the documentation regarding, education. And some of them have also, there are some nonprofit and NGOs in India who have also used this information that I have provided in order to work towards some proposals and some RTI, projects. So people have worked and really thought that the book has been very, very useful. And I'm very happy that I've been able to write that book.
As you said, it's quite rich in detail, and both the archival, especially the English and the Marathi archival material, and the fieldwork. And I wanted to ask, like, to what it is like to piece together a history that was sort of never preserved or never meant to be preserved, and what do these gaps and silences in the academic spaces tell you?
So that is where I think that is my most important contribution as to how I bring together these different so-called unhistorical, trivial pieces, in terms of, for example, they could be memoirs, they could be just, because they are not really preserved very well. Sometimes they're just lines in some, essay, or and these are poems, novels, these are CDs, these are documentaries, all sorts of different, and then voices of people, actual interviews and spending a long time in the field talking with people. So I think that is where it becomes a very layered, textured story, and mixing in, different ways in which people have really, used these different avenues to express their thoughts and, their ideas. And most importantly, they did not write, they could not read, so how could they do it? So, like, for example, this was one woman who was listening to somebody else reading the newspaper, and then she was, oh, uh, I was there at that time. Or, for example, talking about, oh, I remember that there was some political, contest at that time, something on those lines. And then you get to those histories in a very different way. So it is very important to me as an academic and as a scholar to actually get to those nitty-gritties and to find out those minute details. I really, value them, and that is the reason I spend a long time in order to, really build that trust with people and to write those stories with a lot of moral and social responsibility.
I want to now speak about the other book of yours, The Vulgarity of Caste. Um, as you were speaking about archival and preserving the history, I've read somewhere you said that how when you first started looking into it, you were quite appalled by how there was so little written about Dalit women in Tamasha, and how there's so much written about the music and the art form. So, The Vulgarity of Caste opens with the story of Paulabai, and who was a Dalit Tamasha performer whose songs were taken by her Brahmin lover or partner, Pate Baburao. And this is story, the book is a story, weaves through the stories of talent, theft, desire, and caste all tangled together. Right. So you call this sex-gender-caste complex. The idea that caste doesn't just operate through rules about who eats with whom or who marries whom, but also through control of women's bodies and sexuality. Can you walk us through what this means, and can you walk us through quickly Pavlova's story?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is, again, it's very important to underline as to, the kind of history that I do. That is very important here. And that is why, it is through multiple forms of knowledge, through official and unofficial, vernacular Marathi sources that I can actually get to these histories that have been ignored by mainstream historians and even writers, intellectuals for that matter. So, for example, in terms of Tamasha, let me just point out a few things. As you mentioned earlier, and so that is what my book, what I write in my book, and illuminating this what I call the patchy archive of Tamasha. So there are a lot of writings on Tamasha, about the different kind of skits, about the song, about the performers, and so on. However, the problem that I found was the lack of attention paid to the politics of caste, gender, sexuality, popular culture, and most importantly, to the women actors who are absolutely fundamental to the Tamasha theater. And while I was, as I started working on it, I found that in Maharashtra, and people who know about Tamasha, everybody knows about Pathe Bapu Rao, the great Brahman Lavnikar, the maker of Lavnis, the songs, uh, and his lover, Pavalabai Bhalerao Hivargaokarin. That's her full name. People do not know her full name. And this is exactly, when people address women and tamasha women with their first names, or degrading them at times, calling them different things and insulting them. So first thing is very, very important for us to know that Paurabai has a full name, which is Paurabai Bhalera Hivargaokarin. And so when I was reading about tamasha, and talking with people, most of the people, knew about Pathe Bapu Rao. And they, somehow, also mentioned, oh, then there was his lover, Paurabai. But nobody knew her first name. Nobody knew about her family or where she came from. Nobody really knew as to, about her life, or if she even spoke, or what did she actually do, and about did if she expressed any ideas, or how did she go about her life. So there is an absolute vacuum on those lines. And so I mean, this is a basic historical research question. So on the one hand, you have people praising, making Pathe Bapura into this like a godlike figure. He almost become like this supernatural god man who transforms everything that he touches into gold. So, just he has people give him that magical quality, making him very superior, a very intelligent, a very supreme figure. And at the same time, by doing that, and while doing that, they were also denigrating and degrading Paurabai. So she always emerges in in the historical record, in the languages of these people, the language that they use to write about her is always negative. So she is looked upon as a cheater. She is looked upon as somebody who had no mind of her own. She is looked upon as, she's depicted as a woman who was enticing men, a woman who is uh, loose. So it's looked upon as that, as for a woman on the loose. And so almost like a public woman who is very corrupt, who is very jealous, who is, so this all the negative. They've never credited her with anything good. And so that is why, I asked the question as to why is this the case? So, why do we find this discrepancy? And this is very much on lines of caste. Paurabai was a Mahar woman and Pathe Bapura was a Brahmin man. They were lovers. They lived together. They traveled together in Maharashtra and outside. And still we find that, well, one is upheld on a pedestal, that is Pathe Bapu Rao. The other one, Paulabai, is almost just negated at all times. She is never given any space in the Tamasha, in the stories about Tamasha. So that was the problem. And so while I was doing this, that is how, when we look at Paulabai's life, and I also contacted her family members. This was for the first time that, so it has, everything has been, her family is there, in Maharashtra, but nobody has really bothered to find out, her history. So I contacted her family, and I uh, was very fortunate to find a handwritten memoir. And that is how, with these different pieces, I wrote the first history of Paulabai. And this is very important because there were this, fragments, and I have pieced together this with my own historical moral imagination and written this first history of Paulabai. And certainly while writing this, this is where I want to now come to the sex-gender-caste complex that I have theorized in my book. So when Paulabai is looked upon, she is depicted as this loose, so-called loose Tamasha woman. Tamasha women are always, depicted as ashleel, that is vulgar. So, and even in the written literature, written stories about them, as well as the literature that is, that talks, mentions them, as well as the oral interviews that I performed, and I have provided all this evidence in my book. So why is it that certain women become vulgar? Why is it that certain women are depicted as always already ashleel, corrupt, and here especially, why is it that a Dalit Mahar woman, Paulabai, working in the Tamasha, becomes ashleel? And this is where it gets a little complicated, because with Ambedkar, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who was shaping a radical Dalit movement, and especially, since the 1920s, when he assumed the national stage in India. So this was, something that Dalit radicals could not approve of, because as it is, the British and the high caste patriarchal structures looked upon Dalits as effeminate, as weak, as subordinate, as threatening. And that is the reason we see that on the one hand, that was a thing. And so radical Dalit men were fighting against this depiction. They did not want to, I mean, who would want to be looked upon as helpless? And who would like to be called weak? And why should one find enjoyment in being vulnerable? So Dalits were fighting against this depiction, because it really affected them in their everyday life. And that is why they were posing a very strong face to the British, as and a status to the British as well as to the high caste. And while doing that, that means, it also came to some disciplining of sexuality. And this burden fell upon women, because yes, women were considered to be the virtues for the community. But this is where it is important to understand what Dr. Ambedkar, what Baba Sahib Ambedkar the way he has theorized caste and gender. And so by my theorization of the sex, gender, caste system, what I mean is the gendered arrangement of the caste system as they have played in order to oppress Dalit women, and especially for me in this case, Paulabai, because she was from a Mahar, a Dalit caste, because she was a woman. And that is the reason you find that because of that oppressed female sexuality, the coming together of these three regulated her in many ways and her sexuality. And that is why her transgression of these caste boundaries became very, very dangerous to Dalits as well as non-Dalits. So if she was going outside the Dalit community to mingle with men from non-Dalit castes, she was transgressing caste boundaries. And so Dalit radicals, because the woman was looked upon as a jewel of the caste community, she was threatening the caste boundaries. That is a problem. For high castes, because she was a Dalit woman and she was living with high caste men, she was polluting the men and the entire community. So that is how through Paulabai's life, we can understand as to how the sex, gender, caste complex limited Dalit women's freedom, Paulabai's freedom to act and to speak and to have honor and to have virtue. And the most important, and it seems there was a court case in 1905 where the Brahmin community, I mean, this is how the sex, gender, caste complex worked in case of Pauravai's life, for example. One is when, the Brahmin community, when both Pathe Bapurao and Paulabai were living together and performing together, the Brahmin community complained to the British court, the High Court in Thane, Mumbai, that Paulabai, this Mahar woman, was polluting the Brahmin Pathe Bapura. So this is what the Brahmin community complained to the British judge. So of course, this was this is how they wanted the British then to take some action against Paulabai and punish her because because to them she was polluting Pathe Bapurao and the Brahmin community. So this case went to the court, and the court asked Pathe Bapurao and Paulabai to be present, and the judge accused Paulabai of polluting Pathe Bapurao. Most importantly, both of them went together to the court, and there's a description as to how they went to the court in a buggy, and people were standing on the streets, and everybody was very happy to see both. Like, these are lovers, like. So, for example, she's like Madhubala of the early 20th century. So, if just imagine if it was, for example, Shah Rukh Khan or with Deepika Padukone going to the court, something of that. So I'm just talking about the present 2026 situation. So it's a similar kind of thing. And so when they reach the court, the judge, says that, oh, the community is accusing you, Paulabai, of polluting the Brahmin man. So Paulabai, she is not a weak character as some high caste people have written about her. She is a very daring woman who has a mind of her own and who was very bold and very independent. And she responded, she questioned the judge. She said, okay, this is what you are saying, but why don't you just ask the man if this is true? And so the judge asks Pathe Bapurao if he agrees to that it is Paulabai who has polluted him. And Pathe Bapurao tells him that, okay, I'm not going to answer you here. You have to come to my Tamasha theater on a particular date, and then I will tell you what has happened. And so after this, then there is, and then the judge and, they go to this theater in Mumbai where Pathe Bapurao then sings a lavani. And after singing that, he in that lavani, he talks about as to how, he has left the entire world for his love of Paulabai. And he also feeds her a pedha. A pedha, I hope I hope you and my listeners know what a pedha is, and I don't have to translate that for you. But
Yeah,
this is what it was. This is what Paula Bai had to face. She's always accused of something. Well, Bapurao remains, free because of his caste privilege.
I wanted to bring in one point that you make about Tamasha women that became striking but also controversial in context of how Ambedkar created two kinds of women, a moral woman and an immoral woman. That was your criticism. And that the Tamasha performer, the woman who used her body in public, was seen as a threat to the Dalit project itself. As you said, the Dalit radicals did have an issue with it. So that's a hard critique to make as someone who is a prominent figure in anti-caste scholar work right now. How do you make that argument without handling ammunition to people who want to tear down Ambedkar's work for entirely different reasons?
Thank you very much for that. And I have been in my talks and in many of the interviews that I have uh, given so far, and people have brought up that. But here is the thing: I would really urge readers to read carefully. So, what you said is a part of the proposition that I'm making. Yes, on the one hand, I am uh, critiquing, what radicals and Ambedkar did and how they thought about this. But you need to also read the other half, which gets into the details of why we have this problem and how we need to understand and interpret this, and most importantly, these complex pressures that are taking place, and what Ambedkar is doing, and how we need to understand the complexities that he's facing when he is talking about this. So I have to get into details again for that, because as I was mentioning, it is high caste and the British patriarchal thinking that that depicted Dalits as being uncivilized, dirty, docile, childlike, and most importantly, dangerous. So, radical Dalit men who were aware, and especially Ambedkar, who was, thinking so much and, thinking deeply about these negative stereotypes about Dalits and writing against them. So it was very important for them to to confront this depiction. So because for centuries, these are the kind of negative connotations that were made about them. I mean, you look at, for example, some it's in the scriptures, or how the Chandals are looked upon, and why Dalits and Dalits as being dirty and ugly and dark and so on and so forth. And that is why they were radical Dalit men were challenging this colonial and the Brahmini stereotyping of Dalits. And that is why Ambedkar, he invoked a certain kind of manuski, as I write in my book. So manuski is a Marathi word, it is dignified humanity. And Ambedkar invokes this manuski as being, its personhood, its reason, responsibility, as aspects of self respect and of being a dignified human. And this is something which was very, very important, because Dalits were denied this dignified humanity, and they were seen as unmanly or namard. And that is why this was a difference that was created between them and the touchables. And so this cultivation of Marnaski was very important to Ambedkar to protect the basic civic and human rights for Dalits, because Dalits were looked as effeminate and as ashleel, that is vulgar. So in order to do this, and to be looked upon as cultured, Ambedkar and his followers, they also engaged in the founding of for example, the Volunteers for Social Equality, the Samta Sainik Dal, and reforming the Dalit community. So this was the modern politics of Marnaski, as I have written in the book. And that is why we need to understand that when Ambedkar was telling Dalits to change their dress, for example, or it was telling, or the radicals told Dalits to not perform in Tamasha, or told women to abandon their occupations, for example, in Tamasha, or the other, or they were trying to so-called cleanse uh, these women. We need to understand that this is not a narrow patriarchal move. And this is why I've also taken scholars to task, because they have not paid attention to the intersections of sexual labor, of gender, caste, and humanity, especially for Dalits. So this is not something that this is not that Dalits are copying high caste patriarchy. There is this Marnaski, the politics of humanity and dignified humanity, that is very, very important to Ambedkar and to his followers in order to build a Dalit identity, humanity, and masculinity. That is where Marnuski and masculinity, they they come together, and these are the problems and the awkward moments where you see as to how Dalits wanted to become more masculine because of the politics that I talked about. So this is where we need to understand that patriarchy is, first of all, a hierarchical relation among men, British and high caste in this case, because the British and high caste, they characterized Dalits as being different, as being dirty, as being effeminate. And and elite feminist scholars have very easily, really avoided as to elided how these masculinities have been produced at different and complex intersections of age, class, and family and gender. And that is why what Ambedkar and Dalits were doing is not, it needs to be understood, in this set of complexities and complex pressures that they were experiencing in order to carve out a dignified humanity for themselves and the larger community. So we really need to understand, and I want readers to really read the entire chapter and the whole argument.
Since we have segued into feminism and patriarchy and the different complexities, I just wanted to quickly ask about Dalit feminism and the various feminisms. There has been a tense relationship with mainstream Indian feminisms, and which has often been led by upper caste women, upper caste Hindu women to be more specific, and with the global feminist movements too. Where do those kind of conversations stand today? This is slightly different from your work, but I just wanted to quickly
No,
ask.
definitely. And it's very important because there is no one single woman. I want readers to, pay attention to this. There are, women who assume different standpoints, women who have different opinions, women who come from different social, caste, class, religious backgrounds. So we need to understand that women have to, really consider these different identities when they are talking about their feminism. So when feminism is not monolithic, there are, different feminisms. So we have Dalit women who are talking about, Dalit feminism, high caste women who are talking about their own feminisms, and the problems that they face. So historically, we have seen as to how high caste women have not been successful at understanding the problems of caste and gender as faced by Dalit women. And that is the reason Dalit women had to really force their way into talking about how high caste elite feminists need to understand and need to really comprehend, need to be sensitive to the issues that many Dalit women face. So there is certainly a problem, and we really need to understand as to what women are saying, and it is the most oppressed Dalit woman who actually, from their standpoint, it is very important to understand the feminism of those who are the most exploited and the most oppressed, in order to, really build inclusive and a democratic vision for feminism.
I think we've reached we are towards the end of the interview, and I just wanted to ask, we are in this moment where the Indian state is hostile to the kind of work you do, and even globally, there's a lot of hostility to the kind of work you want to do. And you've said that the media coverage of Dalit issues is at best sprinkled. How does the political reality of the current world affect the scholars working on caste in India and abroad?
Okay, yeah, that is a very important question. But let me talk about, how I am working through this. So, especially after, and this brings me to your earlier question too. I mean, especially after the MacArthur Award, how am I working? And I talked about censorship and so on and so forth. So I'll just bring this together so that we can just tie this up, and it will be a
Yes.
good uh, conclusion to our
So the really
yes,
wonderful
to
talk.
our
Yes.
conversation also. So, especially after the award, I have started. I am the founder and executive director of a research center that I am building. This is the Institute for Just Futures, and this institute, IJF, will serve as a transdisciplinary hub for research, education, and community engagement, advancing justice and equity across caste, gender, and social systems. So, with my work at the core, I am connecting with faculty, students, and partners across the United States as well as in Europe and South Asia to examine how historical and structural inequalities have shaped opportunity and well-being and belonging. So I am continuing to work on these lines and even expanding the work even more by committing to building partnerships for rigorous interdisciplinary community centered research. And I am also organizing a symposium in the fall, which will be a deliberate and urgent response to the current climate in which academic freedom, civil liberties, and communities' rights to self determination are under profound threat in India, in the US, and globally. But this is the moment where it is very important for us to, to deeply reflect on what, for me as a scholar, I have done, and to re-examine everything that is happening and this present moment, time that we are in order to reimagine a robust future. And so I'm devoting my energies to working on similar lines, and intellectual inquiry and scholarship is very, very important for that. And I urge people in India as well as the state to continue to support intellectual and academic freedom. This is very important for us to shape our present as well as our future generations. And this is where people need to stop pretending that there is no caste in India, because it is in India or elsewhere, even in the US for that matter. It is very much a reality, and it affects people's everyday living. So people should stop running away from realities. It's best that we engage with them so that we can build a better future.
Thank you so much for the very illuminating and rich conversation you have with us. And thank you for all your work. And hopefully, we'll speak to you again in future. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Aisha.